Fern Shaw, please come to the front of the building. Fern Shaw, your mother is waiting for you at the front entrance. The announcement carries through the Millbridge Elementary School gymnasium on the afternoon of September 19, 1984, bouncing off the cinder-block walls and the folded bleachers, and the smell of floor wax and cold autumn air coming through the propped side door. Once, twice, teachers pause in the parking lot. Parents turning out of the drive look up. The principal stands at the front entrance with one hand shielding his eyes, scanning the small crowd of children, released for the afternoon. No small girl comes through the door. No one with brown pigtails and a green jacket and the white sneakers her mother had bought for the first week of kindergarten comes running across the lawn. The front entrance stays empty. This is September 19th, 1984. This is the day that Millbridge, Maine, stopped being the kind of place where a 5-year-old walking the 4 blocks from school to home was simply what 5-year-olds did. And it is the beginning of a 40-year question that would consume a family, outlast 2 investigators, and find its answer not in a laboratory or a courtroom, but in the results of a consumer DNA test purchased for $12 at a pharmacy counter in the fall of 2023. But to understand what was found 40 years later, you have to understand what was lost in Millbridge on a September afternoon in 1984. Because to understand what was taken from Fern Shaw, you first have to understand what she was. Millbridge sat on the Narraguagus River in Washington County, in the far eastern reach of Maine, the part of the state that tourism materials tended to describe as unspoiled and that residents tended to describe as left alone, which amounted to the same thing from different directions. The paper mill in Harrington, 5 miles up the river road, was the county's largest employer by a margin that made everything else feel provisional. The blueberry barrens covered the high ground between towns in a way that turned the landscape pale blue in late summer, and the fog came off the water in the mornings and settled into the low places and made the county look, most of the year, like a place that was deciding whether to reveal itself. Millbridge proper was a town of approximately 1,400 people in 1984. It had a consolidated school, a post office, a hardware store, a general store that had recently added a VHS rental rack near the back, and the particular social architecture of a place where everyone had gone to school with everyone else, or had parents who had. The lobster boats worked out of the cove at Millbridge Harbor, and the men who ran them came from families that had run them for 3 generations. And on mornings when the weather was good and the catch was up, the harbor smelled of brine and diesel, and something that the people who grew up there associated, without being able to articulate why, with the specific feeling of things being all right. Fern Shaw was 5 years old in the fall of 1984. She had started kindergarten at Millbridge Elementary the previous week, September 9th, her first day, and her mother Carol Shaw had walked her to the front door and watched her go in with the careful attention of a woman memorizing something. Fern had brown hair, worn in 2 pigtails that Carol redid every morning, and a gap where her 2 front teeth had been, both of which had come out in the same week in August, which Fern had considered an extraordinary development and had announced to every adult she encountered for approximately 2 weeks afterward. She was small and quick, and had an established habit of narrating whatever she was doing in a low, continuous murmur, as though producing a private commentary on her own life. She was the only child of Carol and Dennis Shaw. Dennis worked at the Harrington paper mill. Carol worked part-time as a bookkeeper for the hardware store on Main Street. They lived in a blue Cape Cod house on Elm Street, 4 blocks from the school, a walk that Carol had judged safe enough for Fern to make on her own on the days when Carol's schedule kept her at the store until 4. September 19th was one of those days. The last documented moment of Fern's ordinary life was the photograph taken on her first day of kindergarten, a school portrait. The standard kind, taken against a sky-blue backdrop with the child seated on a low stool and told to smile naturally, which produced, in Fern's case, a grin that incorporated the gap where her two front teeth had been, and an expression of complete and guileless confidence. Carol had ordered 3 copies. She had sent one to Fern's grandmother in Calais. She had put one in a frame on the mantel. She had kept the third in an envelope in the kitchen drawer. That photograph would be on every missing persons poster in Washington County within 48 hours. It would be on the side of a milk carton the program had launched that same year, within a month. And it would be on Carol Shaw's mantel for 40 years, in the same frame, in the same spot, because Carol Shaw did not move things that mattered. That was the last ordinary moment. On the afternoon of September 19, 1984, Fern Shaw walked out of Millbridge Elementary at the end of the school day and turned left on Maple Street, which was the first block of the 4-block route home, and was not seen again. The walk home from Millbridge Elementary to Elm Street took, at an ordinary adult pace, about 7 minutes. At a 5-year-old's pace, stopping to look at things, drifting toward interesting sounds, the general meandering that characterized Fern's movement through the world. Carol estimated it took closer to 12 or 15. She had walked it with Fern 3 times in the first week of school to establish the route. Fern had known the way. She had been proud that she knew the way. At 4:15 p.m. on September 19th, Carol came home from the hardware store and found the house empty. At 4:30, she walked to the school. At 4:47, she called Dennis at the mill. At 4:59, she called the Washington County Sheriff's Office. The response was immediate and serious in the way that responses to missing children in 1984 were increasingly being trained to be. The Adam Walsh case 3 years earlier had changed the culture of law enforcement around child disappearances, and the Millbridge deputies who arrived within 20 minutes arrived with that understanding. This was not a child who had wandered to a friend's house. This was something that required everything they had. The search began before dark. The 4-block route was walked and photographed. Every house and yard on every block between the school and Elm Street was canvassed. The neighbors came out without being asked. The mill called over a shift's worth of volunteers. By the following morning, the search had expanded to the full town and the surrounding roads, and the Washington County Sheriff's Department had requested assistance from the Maine State Police. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Sergeant Paul Arbour of the Maine State Police, out of the Macias Barracks. He was 42 years old, careful and experienced, and he understood within the first day that the absence of physical evidence on the route between the school and Elm Street meant the window of exposure had been brief, that whoever had taken Fern had done so quickly, from a vehicle most likely, and had not been witnessed doing it by anyone willing to come forward. He developed 3 persons of interest in the first 3 weeks. The first was a man with a prior offense record who had been seen driving slowly on Maple Street on the morning of September 19th. He was located within 4 days, interviewed extensively, and cleared by alibi. He had been waiting for a friend at that address. The friend confirmed it. The lead closed. The second was a relative of the Shaw family, a distant cousin of Dennis's who had recently had a contentious dispute with the family over a property matter, and who had been in Millbridge the week before the disappearance. He was interviewed twice. He had been in Bangor on September 19th. Bank records confirmed the timing. He was eliminated. The third person of interest was a woman named Roberta Crane. Roberta Crane was 34 years old in September 1984. She was a member of the Millbridge Congregational Church, which the Shaw family also attended. She had known Carol Shaw for 3 years in the way that people know each other through shared pews and coffee hours and the occasional church committee. She was considered by those who knew her as quiet and self-contained, a woman who participated without standing out, who could be counted on to bring a dish to a potluck, and who was easy to forget had been there. She had never married. She had no children of her own. Arbor interviewed Crane in early October 1984. She was cooperative and composed. She expressed sympathy for the Shaw family. She had been home on the afternoon of September 19th, she said, and had no witnesses to confirm it. She lived alone in a rented house on the Harrington Road. But there was no physical evidence connecting her to the disappearance, and no witness who had seen her near the school or on Maple Street that afternoon. Arbor noted her in the file and moved on. By spring of 1985, Roberta Crane had moved to Cherryfield. Cherryfield was the next town over. Arbor noted the relocation in the file. It was not unusual for people to move. He had nothing to hold her on. He noted it and moved on. Carol Shaw attended the same church for 30 years after Fern disappeared. She sat in the same pew. She helped with the same committees. She brought the same lemon bars to the same potlucks. She said later that she had needed the structure, that without a fixed place to be on Sunday mornings, she would not have known how to organize the week around the absence. She did not know that the woman who had taken her daughter had attended the funeral service the church held for Fern in 1988, when the family finally asked the congregation to gather and grieve what they could not yet officially name as permanent. She had stood in the back. She had signed the condolence book. By 1990, 6 years had passed. Fern would have been 11. The age-progressed image the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children generated that year showed a girl with Carol's jaw and Dennis's eyes and hair that someone had estimated would have darkened from brown to something closer to chestnut. Carol taped it to the inside of the kitchen cabinet door, beside the original school photograph from September 9th, 1984, the one with the gap-toothed grin and the expression of complete and guileless confidence. She looked at both photographs every morning when she opened the cabinet for her coffee. Dennis Shaw had not recovered in the way that some people find, over time, a way to function around the shape of what they've lost. He had continued to work the mill. He had continued to drive his truck and pay his taxes and do what the day asked of him. But something had gone out of him in the fall of 1984 and had not returned. And the people who had known him before understood that the man who came to the hardware store for supplies and the man who had coached Fern's future soccer team in his head on Saturday mornings were not quite the same person. By 1997, 13 years on, Paul Arbor had left the Maine State Police and was working private security in Portland. He had passed the Shaw file to the cold case unit at Machias before he left. He had written a 3-page summary of the case for the incoming detective, and on the last page, under a section he headed Persons Not Fully Resolved, he had written Roberta Crane's name. He had written relocated to Cherryfield shortly after the disappearance. No physical evidence. No alibi for September 19th. Church connection to family. Recommend periodic recontact. The incoming detective had read the summary. Roberta Crane's name appeared in 2 subsequent file reviews, in 2001 and in 2009. Both times, investigators in Washington County noted her residence in Cherryfield. Noted a child described as a niece living with her, noted no grounds for further inquiry, and moved on. The child described as a niece had been living with Roberta Crane since 1984. By 2005, Dennis Shaw had died of a cardiac event at 58 years old. He had never known what had happened to Fern. His obituary in the Bangor Daily News mentioned his daughter Fern, missing since 1984, by name. Carol Shaw had asked the paper to include it specifically. She had said that she wanted Fern's name to be in the public record every time there was an opportunity to put it there. The paper had obliged. Carol Shaw was 81 years old when the phone rang in October 2023. She had been waiting for that phone call for 40 years. She had not, in all that time, let herself stop believing it could come. Before we get to who made that call and what it contained, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Every case on this channel takes weeks of research, archived records, old case files, the particular work of following a thread that time has tried to cut. If you want us to keep doing this work, your support is what makes it possible. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Fern. In September 2023, a woman named Helen Greer, aged 67, living in Calais, Maine, submitted a saliva sample to a consumer genealogy service. She had done it on a whim, a birthday gift from her grandchildren, the kind of service that promised to reveal ethnic ancestry and connect people with distant relatives they had never met. She had expected, perhaps, some Scottish heritage confirmed. A second cousin she could exchange messages with, the mild genealogical novelty that most people receive. What the service returned, 6 weeks later, was a close family match to a woman living in Cherryfield, Maine. Helen Greer did not recognize the name. But she recognized, in the match notification, that the service had flagged the connection as significant, a first-degree or second-degree relative, the kind of closeness that means parent, child, or sibling. Helen Greer had no siblings she did not know about. She was not a parent to anyone in Cherryfield. She clicked on the profile. She read what was there. She went to her kitchen table and sat down and stayed there for a long time. Then she called her nephew, who was a deputy sheriff in Aroostook County, and she told him what she had found. Helen Greer was Carol Shaw's younger sister. The case was referred to the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit within 24 hours. The detective who received it, Lieutenant Dana Moreau, had been assigned to the unit for 8 years and had worked 11 cold cases involving missing children. She pulled the Shaw file the same afternoon. She read Paul Arbour's 3-page summary. She read the name on the last page under persons not fully resolved. Roberta Crane, relocated to Cherryfield. Church connection to family. Child described as a niece, living with her since 1984. Moreau drove to Cherryfield the following morning. The woman she found there was 45 years old. She had brown hair, darker than chestnut, closer to the color Carol's had been in early photographs. She had a gap between her 2 front teeth, closed now, grown in years ago, but visible in the particular shape of her smile, in a way that a school portrait from 1984 would have predicted. A buccal swab was taken on site. The results were expedited. The DNA comparison was run against a biological sample provided by Carol Shaw and cross-referenced against the genealogy match that had flagged Helen Greer. The confirmation came back in 9 days. The woman living in Cherryfield, Maine, in the next town over from Millbridge, in the town Roberta Crane had moved to in the spring of 1985, was Fern Shaw. Roberta Crane died in 2021, 2 years before the DNA match surfaced. She had raised Fern as her niece, sustaining the fiction through a set of falsified documents, a birth certificate issued in a different county, a social security number obtained through a process investigators were still reconstructing at the time of this recording, and had maintained it without apparent difficulty for 37 years. She had enrolled Fern in the Cherryfield school system in 1985. She had told anyone who asked that Fern's parents had been killed in a car accident before the child had any memory of them. She had lived 6 miles from Millbridge for the rest of her life, attending a different church, shopping in Ellsworth rather than Millbridge. moving in circles that did not intersect with the Shaws. Circles she had deliberately selected, investigators concluded, for exactly that reason. She had been at Fern's kindergarten class the week before the disappearance, volunteering at a church event that brought the congregation to the school for an autumn fair. She had seen Fern walking the route home on 2 prior occasions. She had been at the hardware store where Carol worked, and she had watched, more than once, the route that a small girl in a green jacket walked alone on the days Carol's schedule kept her late. She had known the route. She had known the schedule. She had known which afternoon would give her the window she needed. She had stood in the back of the church funeral service in 1988, and she had signed the condolence book. Investigators located that book. Carol Shaw had kept it, and found her signature on the 3rd page, in her own hand, beside a note that read, "She will be in our prayers always." The formal investigative conclusion issued by the Maine State Police in December 2023 named Roberta Crane as the person responsible for the abduction and false identification of Fern Shaw. It was entered into the public record. Because Crane had died in 2021, criminal prosecution was not possible. A warrant for her arrest, had she been living, would have included kidnapping and identity fraud at minimum. The record now holds her name beside what she did, and that attachment cannot be undone. The community of Millbridge received the news in the way that communities receive the confirmation of something they had always suspected was possible, but had never let themselves fully believe. Several people remembered Roberta Crane, vaguely, the way you remember someone who attended without distinguishing herself, a face from coffee hour, a name from the committee list. One woman who had served with Crane on the church decorating committee in 1984 said she had not thought about her in 30 years. She said she did not know what to do with the information now that she had it. She said she supposed she was angry, though she could not yet locate exactly where the anger was sitting. Carol Shaw did not attend a press conference. She gave no public statement through that December. She had her daughter. She had what she had waited 40 years for. She did not need to explain it to anyone else first. Fern Shaw is 45 years old. She was 5 years old when Roberta Crane put her in a car on Maple Street in Millbridge on a September afternoon and drove 6 miles to Cherryfield. She has no clear memory of that afternoon. She has no clear memory of Carol or Dennis Shaw. No memory of the blue Cape Cod house on Elm Street. No memory of the 4-block walk or the school or the gymnasium where her name was called twice and nobody came to the front. What she has said she remembers, and this she shared in a brief statement through her attorney, after deliberation, is a smell. The particular smell of a particular house. Not Roberta Crane's house in Cherryfield, which she knew. A different house, one she could not locate or explain, that surfaced sometimes when she opened a cabinet that had been sitting closed in warm weather. A smell of coffee and something lemon-scented and old wood, and a feeling that she had always associated with the word safe without being able to say where the word had come from or what it was pointing toward. The kitchen cabinet on Elm Street in Millbridge, where Carol Shaw kept her coffee and for 40 years, 2 photographs, the school portrait and the age progression series, smelled of coffee and the lemon bars Carol had baked every Sunday since before Fern was born. That detail is not in any investigative report. It is not evidence of anything in a legal sense, but it is the detail that when Carol Shaw heard it, she could not speak for a long time afterward. Some things are held in the body long after the mind has let them go. Some memories exist below the level of language, in the register of smell and warmth and the particular feeling of safety that a child carries forward, without knowing it, is a memory at all. Without knowing it belongs to something, someone, a house with a blue door and a mantel where a photograph stayed in the same frame for 40 years. Fern Shaw had carried that memory for 40 years without knowing what it was. Now she knows. What does it mean that the person who took Fern was present at the church service held in her name, that she stood in the back and signed the condolence book and wrote that Fern would be in her prayers? Does knowing that change how you think about the kind of person capable of this? And for the people in Millbridge who sat beside Roberta Crane in church pews for years without knowing what she knew, what do you think they owe themselves in how they process that? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These are not questions with easy answers, and the people who answer them best are usually the ones who have been sitting with them. Fern Shaw was 5 years old with brown pigtails and a gap-toothed smile and a murmur of private commentary on whatever she was doing, and the smell of her mother's kitchen was the first memory she ever had and the last one she lost. After 40 years, she has her name. She has the source of the smell. And Carol Shaw still has the photograph on the mantel, in the same frame, in the same spot, because she never moved things that mattered. If you believe that love like that deserves to be known, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for being here.